concerned with the proper relationship between planning and politics, and the politics of the society, right? The balancing of different interests in society. The ultimate goal is to institutionalize planning as a government function, and to make the government, reform the government, and make the government do planning properly. And the key goal is what the government can do to achieve its goals of economic growth and prosperity. So it is still like our Hong Kong planners, right? The government's key priorities, economic growth and prosperity, will also be their key priorities. So it coincides with the government's mainstream public policy in the idea of making planning a scientific endeavor that solves social problems. So it is it concerns not just scientific methods like policy analysis, but it concerns more social aspects as well, and political and economic aspects. Now, social learning would be more like what we are doing in this class. It draws from organization development theory. And it believes that society learns from itself. It studies how society learns to solve its problems. And it believes that learning comes through trial and error. So the planner is no longer the only person who has knowledge and apply it to other people. The planner is the person who helps society learn to solve its problems. So the planner is no longer the authority of knowledge, but a facilitator of knowledge. The planner becomes a community facilitator. Right? You see when we go to our workshops, these people who help us run the workshop call themselves facilitators. They facilitate the production of social learning. They facilitate the production of social knowledge. And the production of social knowledge that leads to ways of solving the planning problem in front of us, or the policy problem in front of us. Right? So the planner becomes a community facilitator instead of the scientist, whose role is to promote community participation in the search for solutions. Right? This looks more like what we are doing. And it emphasizes no longer top-down. Right? It emphasizes a bottom-up approach and attempts to empower communities to solve their own problems. But this looks more like the advocacy planning and transactive planning, right? Dialogue. And the gravity and center of planning is moved from the government and district councils and committees to the community. No longer top-down, but bottom-up emphasis. Now, sometimes if things are very difficult to, or if the ideas that you generate from social learning, where you actually know what the community's needs are, wants are, and so forth, and you come up with a plan, but the system has not changed, right? Like in Hong Kong, the government is still very top-down, rational planning. So what do? You need to do something further to make things happen, right? And that is to do social learning together with social mobilization, right? And this is the more radical art of planning. And the roots of these ideas come from socialist governments, even anarchist and Marxist traditions. Planning, therefore, becomes no longer just a social reform. It becomes a form of politics. And what happens is people want to do things to change the whole planning system. They want to change the whole government's concept of planning and the way the government does things. So people at the Queen's Pier will be people who does social mobilization planning. And sometimes we call it radical planning. Radical planning is no longer just about facilitating people, facilitating the community in creating their own plan and executing their plan. Because even if you do social learning and facilitate people to come up with their plans like Ee Tong Street, if the government doesn't care, if the government doesn't bother to adopt the people's plan, can do, right? There's no changes in society. And in that case, some people will go one step further and to make planning now a social movement, a kind of social mobilization. And planning moves away from the notion that the state is neutral and attempting to mediate competing interests. They perceive the state as an instrument of social class whose sole purpose is to facilitate capital accumulation against the interests of the labor or the grassroots or the less privileged people. Right? So planning becomes a kind of social mobilization. It challenges the way planning is being done. So these planning practices, right, let me give you greater details about these three kinds of planning that we have talked about: rational planning, advocacy planning, and transactive planning. Rational planning is what our government is doing right now. It's top-down. First, this is how they do things. What they do first, A, B, C, D. Right? So if you go to planning school now, you learn to operate in this format. First of all, you have a government agency, complete in itself. It doesn't need anybody else outside to help it. All the technology, all the knowledge within the same department. There is a complete agency to do the pre-planning activities. They clarify whose agency, mission, roles, and responsibilities of the planners. And they come up with their intended purpose. They already know what their purpose is, what the government's purpose is, what the government's intention is, right? So it starts not caring about what people's intentions are, okay? But what the government intends to do, what the government's purpose is. And they use a plan to, define these things. And according to that plan, they determine a plan framework and format to execute the government's intentions. So they come up with their own set of established goals, guidelines, and standards. Right? They develop a planning process, what methodologies they use, what data and requirements they need to fulfill, who would participate, right? Like, do I allow a public bidding so different corporations can participate, so on. They coordinate, organize things, and if necessary, the government wants the people to understand its intention, it will do public orientation and public education to inform the public about the government's intention. Not to ask you for your ideas, but just to inform you this is the government's purpose and intention for this planning.